In the last video, we put together our lottery contract inside the lottery.js file. Now we can flip over to our app.js file and import that at the top. So I'll say import lottery from lottery, like so. Now that we have access to this object inside of here, we can interact with the contract to receive information from it or to send transactions to the network to change data that is stored in the contract. So from here on out, it's really going to be an issue of figuring out how to work with the lottery contract inside of the app component. I think that a good first place to start will be to try to get the address of the manager of the contract. Remember that our lottery has a manager property, and that's the address of the person who created it. So let's figure out how we can get that piece of information off the contract and then somehow render it inside the component. In order to get any information off of our contract and render it on the screen or render inside this component, we're always going to follow the same sequence of actions. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to always let our component render. We are going to define the component did mount lifecycle method. Inside there, we will call whatever methods we care about on the contract to receive or fetch some amount of information, and then we'll set the data that gets returned on our component level state, and then show that inside the render method. Now, one quick thing, if you went through that quick introduction to React a couple videos ago in the appendix, you might not have heard about the component did mount lifecycle method. This is a lifecycle method. If we define it on our component, it will be automatically called after our component is rendered to the screen. So it's a great place to load some data or do any other type of activity that needs to be done one time when a component first renders to the screen. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to change back over to my editor. I'm going to define the component did mount lifecycle method. Because this method is called component did mount, it will be automatically called whenever the app component is placed on the screen. Now inside of here, we can attempt to fetch some information off of our contract. So I can say, just like we said inside of our test file in the last couple of videos or in the last section, we can say const manager is await lottery.methods.manager.call. Now, one thing I want to point out here, whenever we are in the Ethereum world inside of a React application, and whenever we are making use of the MetaMask copy of Web3 rather than our own copy, or I should say, whenever we're making use of the provider from MetaMask, as we spoke about just a little bit ago, we don't actually have to specify where this call is coming from. So you'll recall that previously inside of all of our tests, we always said something like accounts at 0. Whenever we're making use of the MetaMask provider, we don't have to specify the from field right here because this copy of Web3 or the provider has a default account already set. And it's going to be the first account that we are signed into inside of MetaMask. So in this case, it would be my account 1. So again, whenever we are writing React code and working with the MetaMask provider, we don't have to specify this from property. So we can leave it as simply call, like so. Notice that we are using the await syntax here, so we do have to mark this component did mount as being async. And then immediately underneath this, we can then set our state for a property that we will call manager. So I'll say this.setState, manager is manager. And of course, we can use a little bit of ES 2015 syntax to condense this down to simply manager, like so. Whenever we make use of state, we do typically want to define our state variables ahead of time. So up inside of a constructor method, we'll say constructor with props, we'll add in super with props, and then we can say this.state has an initial manager property of empty string. Cool, so this looks good. Well, let's now try making use of this manager property inside the render method. So down inside of render, I'm going to find all the JSX that it's already here. I'm going to highlight all of it, and I'm going to delete it all. So we're going to replace this with our own block of JSX. We'll place a div. Inside there, we'll place, how about an H2, and we'll just very loudly declare this is our lottery contract. And then we can place a little bit of information about the contract. In particular, maybe the address of the manager. So how about a paragraph tag with the text, this contract is managed by, and then this .state.manager, like so. All right, let's very quickly run through the order of operations that's going to occur whenever our application runs inside the browser. Our application is going to load up. The app component will be rendered to the screen. That will cause the render method to immediately be called. We'll take this JSX and put it on the screen. During this initial render, this .state.manager will have a value of empty string, because that's what we defaulted it to up here inside the constructor method. After that, the component did mount method will run. We will make a call to the network to retrieve the current state of the lottery contract, in particular the manager's address. We'll then set that state on our component. That causes our component to automatically re-render. That will cause the render method to fire again. And now we'll re-render the component with a defined this.state.manager property. So let's flip back over to the browser and see how our app is doing now. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit. This looks good. So we've got lottery contract, and it says very clearly, this contract is managed by blah, blah, blah. And that right there is my address, as I can double check very easily inside of MetaMask. So there we go, CF019. All right, fantastic. So that's our first taste of retrieving some information off of a contract and displaying it inside of a React component. Honestly, it doesn't get much more complicated than this. This is a pattern right here that we're going to be repeating over and over and over again as we try to work with data off of a contract. The only other thing that we really have to figure out here is how we deal with sending a transaction to a function, or a function that changes some data that is stored on the blockchain. So we still have a good amount of work to do, so let's continue in the next video and start pulling off some other information off of our contract.